So today's seminar title is From Constraints to Opportunities, Open Hardware Driving Global Biology Research. And to illustrate this topic, I'm going to tell you briefly with a little bit more detail what I'm currently working on, is what our research group is doing, and what was my motivation to get into the topic. But I'll keep that very brief to then jump into basically discussing the material that was recently released in the PLOS Biology publication of mine. So my research lab in the team that I'm leading here at the Universidad Católica de Chile, we focus on interdisciplinary research. So we have students from very different backgrounds to develop high throughput methods with droplet microfluidics, as well as instrumentation to advance the biomedical knowledge around the microbiome and cellular interactions. So that means the interaction of bacteria in the microbiome, but also the interaction of bacteria with other kind of cells. But today, as you can see, we don't talk about this biological application in particular, but about our approach to instrumentation development. And so my personal motivation, why do I develop our instrumentation as open source hardware, are the following points that I'll briefly mention, but then we'll take a broader view and not only talk about my motivation, but the whole situation of the field and good examples and so on. So, but for me, one key aspect why we develop instrumentation as open source hardware is that if we develop our own tools, we have a lot of power in modifying them, and that enables us to be really creative and address new custom problems. So really, it's better for research if you have more control about the hardware in your lab and you can modify them more easily, integrate them, whatever you want. Reduction of cost is a huge issue, and that's something that we're gonna also touch on today. And it's, I would say, the most mentioned selling point for open source hardware. So you're able to get access to technology that's normally much more expensive by building it yourself at a reduction of cost. And that's certainly relevant because, well, also here, since I moved to Chile, research grants are a little bit smaller, and it's more challenging to access the same amount of instrumentation portfolio. But that's not only true here, but as you've seen before, I've worked at Cambridge and the EMBL, so those are international elite institutions really with a lot of resources, and there this was also a good approach because you don't always have money for whatever you want to do. Okay. Another really important thing, especially here, is maintaining the equipment in-house. Timing is often critical in research, so it's very important to be able to use your equipment when you need it. But especially if you live far away from the main equipment manufacturers, it can be quite a bottleneck. When things break, it might mean that main lines of your research cannot be performed for months. So being able to fix it yourself is great. Especially we work on high throughput methods, so that it's easy to automate and export data is really essential for our work. So this is really enabled by open source hardware, and it's really great for collaborations and especially involving users of equipment into their development to make them better. So those are the main motivations for me, and I wanted to mention this up front. So that's my personal motivation, and that's why I've been doing this now for almost 10 years to develop things as open source hardware. And one example that we're releasing at the moment is our low-cost digitally fabricated droplet microfluidics workstation with strobe illumination. That's based on a Raspberry Pi system with a custom head that we developed for control. And then this sort of 3D printed stage that can be used with syringe pump or pressure-driven systems to generate microfluidic droplets, like in this picture. And we've already used this in training. So we used the station during advanced training course from the European Molecular Biology Organization in May 2023. And now just in 2 weeks, we have coming up a very exciting workshop here in Chile, where participants will build their own instrument, learn how to use it, and take it home to their labs to use it for their research. But this is just an example of the kind of things we're developing to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. We will not talk further about my particular developments or our team, but this is the last slide for the background. And I just wanted to mention that I've been thinking and looking into open hardware for a long time. So here are some of the open source hardware related publications that I've published over the last, well, since 2017, really. So if you're interested to read more, so today we're going to talk about this top publication, but there are many other interesting things. So if you want to learn more about the topic, of course, I'm not the only one who has published on this topic, but there's a substantive collection, and I've also co-founded the Journal of Open Hardware. So much about my background and my motivation. And now I would like to jump into the main topic for today's seminar, which is this publication that we published earlier this year in PLOS Biology. And it's titled Open Hardware from DIY Trend to Global Transformation and Access to Laboratory Equipment. And our paper was featured on Kudos. And there we phrased the whole idea of the paper and the title in simple language. So I'm going to use that to maybe explain a little bit about this. I'm very excited to have published this and today to have the opportunity to discuss it with you, because this is really a condensation of my thoughts around the topic and what we're really trying to achieve with this kind of development, not only for our lab, but more broadly for the scientific community. So really this article is about how the sharing of instructions to build equipment increases the global access to perform experimental research that otherwise maybe they would like to do, but they can't. And so why is this becoming a big topic at the moment is because it's become easier and easier to build your own equipment, especially with the rise of 3D printing and having really fantastic 3D printers available pretty much everywhere in the world, maybe not absolutely everywhere, but in most research settings. And people also increasingly publish their equipment openly. And they hope that this helps them that it gets replicated, that other people use their research, that it has impact. But really, there is very little evidence for this. So there are very few publications like this, like mine, that discuss the issue on a meta level. So people might release a certain hardware design, but then the question is, how do you actually design it that it works well? And so this is what I discuss in this article and what I would like to discuss with you today. And so this particular study that I've published here provides evidence that open technologies really do help to access tools in low resource environments. And I dissect the best practice approaches for how can you design your equipment so that it really is replicable everywhere. Because there are a number of things to take in mind that I've learned through my experience that are not so commonly known or respected. And of course, this is not the ground truth. So all of this is my opinion. Of course, it's based on discussions with many people, but I like this to be a contribution towards the discussion. So I would really like to hear from all of you. What do you think? And maybe there's things I've forgot about, or I've seen it like this, but really it works differently. And because of the lack of data around this topic, it's very difficult to know for sure what's right and what's wrong. So this is what makes sense to me and what I've observed and what works for us. So if we're trying to generate data, if we're trying to look at what do people really publish, do they use it, is it useful? Yeah, again, there's not much data, but we can look at the papers that have been published and what they're talking about. And when we do that, we have to be aware, and you see that a little bit in this map. So this map has been distorted according to how much people publish in different places. So when we're talking about what people are talking about and where people are talking about what, we have to keep in mind that so the per capita rate of publication is not the same. So there are some places in the world like the US, England, Germany, France, China, Japan, that publish much more compared to other countries. So if we look at Latin America here, for example, it's really shrunk because the number of publication per capita is quite low. So we have to look at relative numbers. And I did this for the publication. I did a little bit of a data analysis. So first of all, let's see how many people actually talk about things that are related to open technology and to making things yourself. Well, now these are abstract topics, so most people don't necessarily mention these meta categories in their paper. But what people are talking about is, for example, 3D printing. So there are 60,000 publications since 2018, so basically in the last 5 years. And there are also 20,000 papers that mention open hardware. So that's really nice. There are about 10,000 mentioning Arduino microcontrollers and 6,000 mentioning the Raspberry Pi computers. So there's a substantive number of papers out there, sort of thousands, tens of thousands, that actually do mention tools that are relevant for do-it-yourself, DIY, fabrication, or open source hardware. But now, of course, it's very difficult to know if these people are really talking about technology access and releasing designs. So these topics can still, they go beyond what we're talking about today. So that's not enough. So I looked at a closer proxy, and this I will explain these two graphs that are here. So they're already figures from the publication. And so on the left, what we see is basically the general publication. So this is basically, I mean, this is just a picture from World Mapper that I didn't do myself. This is Torted Map, but it's something similar in a graph. So here's really how many indexed peer-reviewed publications are there per country. So the box is 100%, and then you see, the US, the Kingdom, Germany, and China, and so on dominate the whole picture. So we always have to keep this in mind as a baseline. So if you want to think, do people in some places talk more or less about a certain topic, we need to keep in mind that it's relative to the general amount that they publish. Okay, so here on the left, I try to find an answer on the question, do people really mention technology, mention these open technologies or DIY technologies in a context or in countries where they generally have lower access to research resources? That means, funding and infrastructure and so on. And how did I do this more specifically? So while these above topics can be quite broad, so for example, a paper mentioning open hardware could be a business study or just a thought paper, or 3D printing could be about, I don't know, making a metal printer or something very technical, not necessarily around technology access. So, but the Arduino microcontroller and the Raspberry Pi computer, these are very particular boards that are available. And so I looked at the publications that use these keywords in their methodology section. And so with that, I hope that so this is just my approach to actually find some systematic insight, because we say that this gives technology access, but we don't really know. So when we look at that, the chance I think is quite high that if they use an Arduino, for example, in their method section, that they've really used the Arduino to implement something as part of their research study. And so when we look for these two things in the method section, we do find the graph on the right. And now what's interesting to me is the difference between this to the general level of publication. So in particular, all the countries highlighted in black, those are significantly bigger. So they publish significantly more papers with using in their method section these DIY tools than they publish overall in the scientific literature. So you can say that these countries, or this is the inference that I would do, so I would conclude that these countries indeed use these low-cost DIY approaches to get access to certain technology, perform experiments in the lab, more than in high resource settings where you would maybe buy another instrument. So you don't have to build your own, for example, using an Arduino microcontroller, but you're just going to buy an off-the-shelf equipment and not mention Arduino in your method section. So with this, I think we can conclude that indeed, in many lower resource countries, in the academic literature, people do use DIY as such an approach. Of course, it's very preliminary. I would like to know a lot more detail. So, okay, they use Arduinos and Raspberry Pis. I also have to mention that Raspberry Pis in themselves are not open source, but they're often used to implement DIY solutions in the lab. So I would say, yes, people use it. I would like to know a lot more. How many use 3D printing, for example, but it's very difficult to assess exactly how they use it with this kind of method. So I would like to see other people who focus on this kind of study and not on actually developing technology like our lab, to maybe get more insights. But preliminarily, I think that's really nice. I've not seen any other evidence really on this. So this is one thing we provide. And then the question is, okay, if people do use these DIY methods in their research to gain access to technology, then do they just do it because it's cheaper, because they don't have enough money? So that's an important question, because money is often used. And as I've mentioned before with my own motivation, money is not the main motivation. So it's a very important part, but there are many other things. So there is another interesting publication. It's not by me. Here it's called Instruments of Change for Academic Tool Development in Nature Physics. And it's also a very nice read. I can recommend it. It's very brief, but they highlight that open source hardware is a really nice way, and they don't talk really about cost so much, but normally if you build an instrument and you want to disseminate it, then you invent it, then you go to the technology transfer office of your university and you ask them if they're going to pay for your patent maybe. Then you can file a patent that might be granted or not, usually takes some years. And then, the industry is not just going to come knocking on your door, but you also have to get in touch with industry and find someone who's actually going to license your invention or buy it. And so that also usually doesn't work. And so here we're already sort of 3 years down the line, at least, if not 5 or more. And then the industry, so why do they license your patent? Then they have to build this into a product and release it. Or sometimes they just buy it to avoid competition, and they're going to trash it right away as part of their strategy and just block it. But if they do it, they also still have to develop something and release it, and that has to be popular. So this is the normal sort of technology transfer route. And it can take very, very long. And there are many parts where it fails, and they're usually outside of the control of an academic. So with open source hardware, you have this possibility of disseminating right away to the user group. And this can be much quicker and much more direct. So people can build usually with a relatively low cost and follow these instructions, their own instruments, or sometimes maybe a small company also does that and they sell the kits or something for yours. Or many academics also do this themselves, so that they sort of supply support for people that want to do it in order for their invention to really have an impact in the community. So that route is not just about the money. So actually this is a little bit counterintuitive. You can still make money in this route as well, but I guess the traditional route is more where you would have financial gain as an inventor. But what we're trying to do as scientists in general, is to have impact with our work. And so we are paid for our work and not necessarily for our patent inventions. And so it's not all about the money. And here I made another graph because, and this is really something I've tried to condense. So this is not a standard comparison of parameters. So I just, especially moving from Europe and having worked in the US as well, coming to Chile, I do notice certain differences when it comes to technology development and infrastructure. And some things are more difficult to implement here. And the last 3 years that I've been here in Chile, or almost 3 years now, I've thought a lot about what could these things be. And so I've tried to look for data sources that could show a little bit or represent this observation that I made. And so I came up with this graph where on one hand side, I put how many researchers there are in research and development per million people. So, and then on here, these dots, they're all countries. And so if a country, let's use the US, for example, the USA has a relatively high number of researchers per million people. But really, there are many other countries like Denmark, that has almost twice as many. So they're not leading in the world, but they have a relatively high amount. So if you're sort of over this line of 4,000 researchers per million people, I just say that you're basically a high science environment. So there are a lot of researchers around. It makes it easier to hire good talent, maybe. People are more likely to kind of understand where you're coming from and talk about science and like science. And this is something that I was very used to in the places that I worked and lived, like England, the US, New Zealand, Germany. But then in Chile, I realized that these science and technology topics, they're almost completely absent from the media. Most people don't know anyone who works in science or technology. And so they're just more disconnected, and it's less available to talk about science development. And so I think this is a limitation other than just funding that I observed, and I try to show in this graph. And the other dimension that I found is another kind of resource that's not directly related to money, which is, in this case, the country economic complexity index. So this is an economic measure about how complex are the products that a country produces and exports. And so the more technologically advanced those are, so some countries specialize, for example, in the export. Well, this is also the case of Chile, really. 70% of the economy, last time I looked, is driven by the export of raw copper. So you mine a lot of copper. Lithium is also becoming really important, and you get it out of the soil and you sell it. So that's a very basic product. So that has a very low economic complexity. But if you make computers or cars, these would be very complex. Just to give an example. And so you can, and there's this index that says which country has how much complexity in their industry. And so you can see some things that make intuitive sense, right? For example, China, they do have a lot of researchers, but it's a huge country. They don't have a very high concentration of researchers in their population, but they do have a lot of high complexity products. So they're really good at making things, but not necessarily doing science with it. So this is high technology environments. Mexico is here too. And then there are high science environments, like Norway or Australia. And Australia is an interesting country as well, because they are known in the academic environment. They have a lot of very good science centers, a lot of very good researchers, but their economy is also mainly built on mining. So they actually don't have a very complex industry. And these things are relevant because this tells you a little bit of what's accessible in your neighborhood. So what kind of components can you buy in your country? What kind of things do they sell in local electronic distributors? So depending on, this cannot just be driven by academic research labs. So who else buys, I don't know, microcontrollers? I mean, Arduino is very common, but some other more specialty parts maybe. And this will tell you something about how easy it is to access infrastructure that you need, workshops, components, and talent. And so then, of course, it's easier if you're in this science and technology enriched environment. And Chile is, where was it? Well, I don't see it now. Should have looked it up again. Anyways, this is not only about Chile, but as you can see, most countries are down here in a low resource ecosystem. So when I talk about low resource, I don't only talk about science funding, but also access to components and people. Okay, and because of this, there are two very important points made in the paper, and I'm just going to mention them briefly. So local fabrication and availability of components and parts are really key. So if you want your invention to be relevant somewhere, that you want it to achieve global access, so you invent an interesting method as a scientist, and you want other people in the world to be able to build it and use it to solve their local problem or adapt it to their local circumstances. And for that, they need to be able to acquire those materials that you work with. And so that's an important message of my paper for me to everybody. That's important to think about it. So in many of these places that don't usually have access to these tools, they also don't have access to all the components that you might have access to in the US or in Europe. So it's very important that they can fabricate some of those specialty parts. Or if they can't fabricate them, then it's important to think about using standard components in your design that might be accessible in most places in the world. So for example, the Raspberry Pi and the Arduino, they're often used also in these research studies, I think, because you can buy them anywhere. You can buy them in, in Ecuador and in India and everywhere in the world. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And so we like to use a lot 3D printing, because with this, you can very easily, anywhere in the world, make very complex objects that are specific to your hardware and modify them. And then developing things locally is a lot about appropriate technology. So this is something, I'm just going to pull out the definition again that I gave in my paper. Oops. Well, here I have it. So appropriate technology is another term that I would like you to have heard at the end of the seminar. And so the term appropriate technology is a very useful way of phrasing it, and it can be used in publications too. So the question is why, if you build something yourself and maybe it doesn't look as fancy or doesn't have a shiny metal color on top of it, but why is it so important to develop these tools and share them? It's because they're more appropriate for the kind of use that you're putting them to. And an appropriate technology is defined to be appropriate when it's compatible with local, cultural, and economic conditions. For example, the humans that use it, the materials, the cultural resources or the economy in the place where this method is supposed to be applied. So if it's compatible with those circumstances, and if it utilizes locally available materials and energy resources with tools and processes maintained and operationally controlled by the local population. This is appropriate technology. So it makes a lot of sense to develop things that look different, even maybe, if they are more appropriate for what you're trying to do. So it's not just about being better or less bad. Can they do this very fancy other thing that you're not trying to do with the method? Maybe yes, maybe not. But that's not what this is about. This is a tool that's really appropriate for this context. And hopefully then they're also open source. So that makes them even more appropriate for science and sharing. Okay, so now this has all been a lot of background. So to make sense of what this means specifically to open source hardware designs, I created these 10 different types of open hardware. So open hardware 10 years ago, when I started being active in the community of open hardware, it was not very well known, and there were very few examples. But now more and more things get published, as we have seen, tens of thousands of papers. So it's really a movement that is taking off, and the trend is growing very quickly. And so now I'm aware of many, many different kinds of projects, but not all of them achieve this access to technology globally that I'm talking about. And this is why I try to categorize, I would say even stereotype, different kinds of projects, giving some examples to show what are approaches that I perceive in the community to build open source hardware, and which of these are really appropriate to provide access to laboratory equipment globally. So let's jump into some of these categories that I created and look at the parameters that I picked for the study. So there are many things maybe that you could highlight in open hardware, but I picked these 5 categories because I think they're particularly important for the context of technology access. So let's look. We've already mentioned cost. So low cost is good. So if the score is higher in this category, it means that it's cheaper. Okay. And then there's openness here. So openness is very difficult to quantify. There are some approaches available. I don't want to go into too much detail. Happy to discuss it with you. But how I try to put a scale to this in this context is by saying, how many files are you likely to release? How much intellectual property, I don't know, is there really opened up through these kind of projects? So do you release a lot of 3D printable files and design files? Do you have, electronic board designs that you release, open source software that go with a project, or, or just an assembly instruction, for example, of commercial parts? And then there's not much that you share in terms of open source files or property. So there's openness. Okay, then there's local fabrication. And I've just mentioned this to you. If you want that people get access to your technology in different places where they can't get specialty components, it's good that they can locally fabricate it. So how suitable is the design really to local fabrication? How much 3D printing is involved, for example? And then adaptability. So this is a really important branch as well, I think, if you think about development and access to technology. Maybe what you build doesn't really make exact sense. So for example, something we've struggled with here in our building is that sometimes we have electricity spikes in the network, and actually important expensive equipment breaks because they're not protected from that. And I don't know, maybe in other places you don't have these electricity spikes, I don't know. But you might not consider that in your design, or we have earthquakes, so things fall down. So let's just say you make a design and then we want to use it, but really we need to make some modifications to it so that it works well for us. So how adaptable is the design? I think that's an important category. And the last one is also very essential when we're talking about biosciences. And this is how possible is it basically for a biologist, so that's not a specialty engineer who is, I don't know, trained in developing electronic boards. How possible would it be for, let's say, a bioscience PhD student who really uses a lot of this equipment and wants to make some changes or wants to improve it for their research? How possible for them would it be to understand your design and contribute to it? So it can require a lot of dedication maybe, but how possible is it with their background? And this is really important because this is a big disconnect normally in industry. So normally the people that design equipment are not the same as the ones that use it. And this is a big design challenge. So this is why in the end, a lot of equipment is not very nicely designed from the user perspective, because it's very difficult to get that communication right. So if people can modify things themselves to make it suit to themselves, you get much better solutions and more, localized and everything. Okay, so with these 5 categories in mind, let's look at different open hardware projects and see how they perform. So a very obvious category is a simple 3D print. So now there are hundreds of thousands of designs available on different websites like Thingiverse or Printables. And you can just go online, you can find a nice piece of thing that you want to have for your lab, like a tube holder or something. You have them here, we just adjusted some of the tube holders, for example, to hold little cuvettes and cryo vials. And you can just print them out and then you're done. That's very easy to make. So let's say local fabrication, top score, very easy to make anywhere. Adaptability, it depends. So you can't really transform this into a very complex equipment. These are simple things. But it's usually pretty easy to adapt, even though many people, unfortunately, only share the STL file, like the cloud of dots, and not necessarily the actual design, which is very important to really make parametric changes. Also, sharing things in a parametric way is still a bit limited. So in real terms, that's why it doesn't have a perfect score there. So it's very possible to adapt, but those are those limitations of complexity and sharing practices right now. Very understandable for a biology user, and they can make those modifications no problem. And yes, you share the files that are really, so pretty much everything that you share is modifiable, even though, yeah, the complexity is also limited. And it's pretty cheap. So this is a good thing, and I can just recommend you guys to print stuff for the lab. And then the record holder in terms of price is frugal do-it-yourself hardware. So this is a category that, well, or at least the researcher that I most associate with this approach is Manu Prakash from Stanford. But there are many other interesting designs out there as well. For example, to just use a string and a disk of paper that you cut out and make a centrifuge from it, or use the in the background there, I have a foldscope made from paper. So these are ultra cheap devices that are actually, in those cases, not necessarily published with an open license, but anyone can really make this. So local fabrication, yes, very, very cheap. Users can understand the design and modify it if they want. There are not many files that are shared. They're not for digital fabrication usually. So the files are very sort of accessible, but yeah, they're not like many of them, or complexity again is limited. The same is for adaptability. Now let's go to the next point, open maintenance. So for example, there has been a really interesting paper, I think last year, about repurposing the HiSeq DNA sequencing machines. So those cost, I think, over €1 million, dollar, whatever, to buy this equipment. Is really fancy equipment. But because DNA sequencing is done in so many places, they are available in many places, and they have been taken out of service by Illumina. So you have this expensive machine, but you can no longer really use it, and it's not maintained. So they made a hack of the system to use the pumps and liquid control and fluorescent readout laser systems that are all inside this fancy machine and the computer to really make a fluorescent staining and washing microscope that can scan large samples. So it's a really, really fancy, useful new tool they made out of this very expensive sort of trash thing that sits in many places of the world. Very nice example, but I don't normally work on these kind of projects. And here's why. So if you look at the area of my rating of this kind of project, they're a lot less suitable for technology access for different reasons. So for example, can you make any of this locally? Not really. So if you have it, so why doesn't this have a worse score? So this is actually that, in my view, these kind of projects that I've seen, so this is just an example, right? So there are many other projects. Actually, the things that you need to change, they do usually do with very accessible tools and standard components and a lot of 3D printing. So if you do need to change anything in there, that is probably nicely shared. But the thing is that if you don't have one of these sequencers, there's really not much you can do. Is it cheap? Yes, it's cheap if you happen to have one of these things. And this is about adaptability. So also, these are very complex devices. So often you have to make some modifications. They're kind of very difficult to work with. They're not very user-friendly components in there. They're usually made for, like, optimized for industrial fabrication. So if you want to adapt these designs further, so if people share that, you can maybe replicate it, but adapting it further is usually hard. And you can't do much that's not already there. And so this is not very user-friendly for a biologist to really understand and change the design usually. And there are not many open files shared because it's all based on this thing that's accessible. So it's nice, it can be useful, but it's not a scalable approach to technology access. And then it's also a thing of the moment. So now people have this old equipment, but then, you know, you can't really get a new one, you can't get it somewhere else, very limited. Okay, then there's open wetware. So in a biology context, that's really interesting. And I think this is up and coming, and these scores will improve over time as this develops further. This is very friendly for biologists because it's really about biologist wetware. So this is about open source enzyme sequences and so on. These are shared openly, but it's still a new approach. So a lot of the DNA sequencing and DNA synthesis and then enzyme production, a lot of that also has to do with digital fabrication. So there are some, you know, if you share DNA, you can synthesize the sequence. It's not so cheap normally. Can you make it locally? That's the goal, but, you know, synthesizing the DNA locally can be a challenge, or importing it even. And Adapting it is very difficult still, but this is because it's a new field. Like how easy it is to modify a protein, for example, it's not so easy yet, but it's a very interesting and very new emerging type of open hardware that is a good thing to keep an eye on, to watch the space. Oh, I started with those because I skipped this. Yeah, I was very confused, sorry. So actually this should have been the first slide I showed. So this is examples, because these are not the most important examples I wanted to talk about. Sorry, I wanted to start here, but we do it now, it's fine. So the most important example that I wanted to talk about is what I call the sweet spot. So I've been talking about do's and don'ts a little bit. How do you design your open hardware to really be accessible for open hardware? And there are a few projects that in my eyes, they really max out the space of these categories. And so I call it the sweet spot. So this is what I would recommend you try to do. So this is really a lot of local fabrication, a lot of 3D printing, for example, or laser cutting, very adaptable, understandable to biologists, which can just mean if your hardware is complex, it can mean a lot of documentation, a lot of hardware that's shared, so 3D printable files and software and anything else you might need. And usually they also come at a very low cost, normally around 1 to 10% of the cost of comparable commercial equipment. I should say proprietary equipment, because these can also be commercially acquired as kits sometimes. So then they're also commercial, but they're not patent protected, so they're not proprietary. And in contrast to this, there is a technology development approach that's, or an open hardware approach that's the most popular. That's the most popular one here. And I call it the expensive assembly. And it's particularly popular in this area of the LIBREhub project of bioimaging. So people share instructions how to assemble usually just Thorlabs components into extremely expensive microscopes that, however, are not necessarily available on the market right now. So they do provide access to technology. And it's good that people share this, but it has very, very poor rankings in all of these technology access categories. So it's nice that now with these instructions, people they have less know-how, so they might not know from scratch how to design a custom microscope, but with these instructions, they can assemble a new kind of high-performance microscope that they couldn't just get off the shelf. But it's not necessarily cheaper. So this might still cost tens of thousands to millions of dollars, all the components, and none of these components is open source or possible to digitally fabricate normally. So very poor open source performance. Sometimes they have software that they share openly. You cannot make any of it locally. So this is not accessible globally. This is only accessible in high resource settings. But it is possible to adapt. So that's a good score. So this is very modular usually. So it's very easy to swap things out and get other things that would fit in there. So that's nice. And yes, these things can be understood by biologists depending on how good the instructions are. But it is a very big difference in terms of these sweet spot and expensive assembly projects. So I really recommend people to think about what parts of this can be done in a more shareable, locally fabricated and cheaper way to really improve the accessibility to their methods. And then there are these open platforms. So this is like a certain community. For example, electrophysiology is very good in that, and optogenetics. They need kind of quite fancy tools for their basic research. And so there are equipments available, but they're only produced in a few places by small companies, and they're very expensive. So the community has developed some very interesting open source acquisition boards that are very extendable and sort of cheaper. And that's really nice. Again, they're biology user-friendly, and they are usually adaptable. They are really open source. They share all the files, but they're medium cheap. They're not that cheap. You do usually save something, and you can't make them locally. So these are just produced, and you basically have to buy the kit. So, but that's a nice, interesting kind of open hardware that I observe. to really have some common basis in the community using some boards specific to a certain scientific community that is open and extensible. And then there is the most popular category of all. There are so many people talking about doing things open, wanting to do things open, but for one reason or not, they never share what they do. So unfortunately, these things are not open source. So they may be cheap, they might be possible to implement locally, and they might be friendly to biologists, but they're just not shared. So good for you. And unfortunately, this is not always, I mean, I think there are a lot of good intentions behind this. But unfortunately, yeah, with the timeline of the thesis, there's just not enough time to document anything, or files get lost, or sometimes it's the technology transfer office of the university that tells you that you cannot release this university intellectual property. So there are many reasons why things don't get shared. I think many times it's just connected to sort of time and student fluctuations, but that's a real shame. So I think increasingly things get shared, but I would say, 80% probably of things that people really implement and that work, they don't share it in the end, which is a shame. And then, of course, it's not open, no matter how much you talk about it or how many YouTube videos you release on you using the thing. It's just not possible for someone else to make it. Okay, now we've already gone through those categories that are already, you can see they're a little bit more specific. So they're very simple, or, this open maintenance one, which is a specific case that you need an expensive hardware to sit around. Okay, and then the last categories. So there is open infrastructure. So for example, the CERN, the Large Hadron Collider Infrastructure Maintenance Organization in Europe, they develop the entire CERN infrastructure as open source hardware. And this is because it's very complex specialty equipment, and they just need to make sure that they know what's where, how it works, and how they can get a new one. So often maybe small companies develop a certain part of their custom infrastructure, and if they lose interest or they go bankrupt, then CERN has a problem. So they need to maintain this design. So they're a big, through that they've been a big pioneer in open source hardware, like the CERN Open Hardware license that I always recommend comes from there, for example. And they have this White Rabbit project. Here's an example that allows very, very precise timing synchronization across places that are far apart. So in different parts of this many kilometer wide particle accelerator, they need to make measurements and sort of coordinate their equipment operation. And they developed this open source board, for example, that is now used in many other instruments as well. And that's really nice. But these things are usually very expensive, and they're not suitable to biologists or local fabrication. But they are definitely open source and adaptable. And this can be nice, for big infrastructure. And then there's the purists, for example, making an open source processing core. So these are the people that really want to get to the core of technology and make everything open source. But from a biology perspective, this doesn't have a lot of relevance. So it's nice to have open source cores, but in the end, usually for our equipment, we just need a processor that works. And if it's open source or not, doesn't make a big difference for us personally. And these are often, also very expensive, and you can't make them locally. And there is particular kind of engineering or physicists that work on this. And this is particularly interesting in the FPGA sphere. So these reprogrammable computing boards. Yeah, so I wanted to mention it definitely for completeness, but not so relevant maybe for bioaccessibility. So those are the 10 categories that I can discern from all the different kind of open source things that are out there. And now I want to go through, so yeah, I wanted to keep it short, but that didn't work. So now I just want to mention, and you can always look at the article for more details again. But this is a biology lab in Cameroon in Africa, where they've built themselves a lot of interesting hardware to get access to technology, or use sort of low-cost accessible instruments and repurposed instruments as well, like a pressure cooker instead of an autoclaver, for example. Yeah, I don't have enough time to really look into this with you together right now, but the key message is that there are not that many labs that have a lot of open hardware at once. So most people have 1 or 2 pieces in their lab, and the rest is a mix usually, and especially in low resource environments, I observe that there's a lot of using reused equipment you inherited from someone, or old equipment. And then you have some new equipment that that's either cheap or you got an equipment grant, for example, to get it. And then there's some self-built equipment. But there's increasingly also some examples like our lab and this one that really make open source a strategy, and they have a lot of open source hardware equipment. And so the next 2 pictures are actually from our lab. So again, this is a reused microscope, but we made some 3D printed adapters, for example, around bioimaging. There are all kinds of really cool open hardware instruments that are already published and released, a lot of them usable with 3D printing and laser cutting. And there's liquid handling, gel electrophoresis, and transilluminator, plate holders, pipe tip sorters, syringe pumps, and microfluidics equipment, all kinds of interesting things, pipette holders that are available, and including the Open Trans robot, which is also like a kind of community platform, like an open source commercial tool. And mentioning commercial tools, I want to make very clear that open source hardware is not the opposite of commercial activity. In fact, I think it can be a very good innovation strategy. And there are many interesting companies out there that use open source hardware as their business model. And so in this paper, I gave a number of examples of companies related to biology labs in the widest sense. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up a little bit late. So thank you very much for your attention.